God had my attention. There were some gaps in my own spiritual formation that I realized that were almost killing me. You know when you think you hit rock bottom, but you're not? I found out that the bottom was a lot deeper than I imagined. I like to call it my second conversion. And I realized something, that emotional health and spiritual maturity are inseparable. That it's not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature.
Good morning. I'm Pastor Justin. If we haven't met, I'm the pastor of spiritual formation, and I'm so glad that you're here today. Please pray for me as I continue to train our lead pastor and try to share the Bible with him a little bit more. So it's going to be hard, but we're going to get there. So I'm glad you could be there with us today. If you want to grab your notes in a Bible and turn to Matthew 26, we're going to look there today. So far in this study, once a year around this time, we have a small group study that meets together and we study a particular topic. And this year we've been studying Peter Scazziero's book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. We've had over 30 groups. We've had approximately 400 people participating. One thing that really excited me, about 80 of those 400 people are people that are either new to our church within the past year or people from outside of our church that are participating, which is really exciting to me. And I know as I've heard testimonies, a lot of people are struggling with a lot of it, and in a good way, having some really great discussions, feeling like there's some things that are kind of being wrestled up inside of them, and it's part of the process. And I hope you've been hearing from the Lord in the midst of the study, even if you haven't been part of a small group, just being here on Sundays. The main lesson that we've been learning from emotionally healthy spirituality is this, that it's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. It's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. And we've heard about signs that we're emotionally unhealthy. We've been learning about what it means to know yourself, know your identity, and see where God has established your identity. We've learned about going back to go forward and identifying how our families of origin and other stuff have had to be dealt with by Jesus so that we can move forward and break the power of the past. Last week, Pastor Matt had a great message about journeying through the wall, about Abraham and how Abraham needed to let go of power and control and have another one of those belt tests, and how sometimes we're called to those moments where there's like a belt test that we need to come to Jesus and Jesus can help us to continue to move forward. And this week we're going to look at this lesson that God can do transformational work in and through us when we embrace our limits. God can do transformational work within us and through us when we embrace our limits. Basically, we're going to look at grief and loss, but look at it in a slightly different way. And to me, as I read through this book again to prepare for our study coming, and I'd read it years ago, but as I reread it, this chapter 5, was the part that really struck my heart, the idea of limits. I just want to share one or two quotes that he has in there. The first one, he says this: loss marks the place where self-knowledge and powerful transformation happen if we have the courage to participate fully in the process. Loss and grief, however, cannot be separated from the issue of our limits as human beings. We cannot do or be anything we want. God has placed enormous limits around even the most gifted of us. Why? To keep us grounded, to keep us humble. How many of us heard the statement growing up where we've told our kids, you can be anything you want to be in this life. You can be anything you want to be in this life. It seems such a nice thing to say, but it's a complete lie, right? You and I can't be anything we want to be in this life. Each one of us is born with limits of some kind in our life. Some we're born with. I'm never going to be an NBA basketball player. That's just how it's going to be. I didn't choose that. I just could never have gotten to that point. Some we do choose. When I chose to marry my wife, Janelle, I also chose not to marry billions of other women on the planet, right? And so that's a limit that I have, a good limit. Some are put on us, limits at home, at work, at play, in the government. Some happen suddenly, losing a loved one, losing a job. And some are within our control, and many are not within our control. And most of us, I believe, are not huge fans of limits. In fact, Peter Scazzero says this: that is the painful lesson for all of us to learn. Our egos tend to be so inflated that we act as if we were God. Often we have larger fantasies and wishes for ourselves than our real lives can support. As a result, we work frantically trying to do more than God intended. We burn out thinking we can do more than we can. We get stressed and we blame others. We run around frantically convinced that the world, whether it be our churches, friends, businesses, or children, will stop if we stop. Others of us get so depressed because our desires are so high and unachievable that it seems useless to do anything at all. Getting off our thrones and joining the rest of humanity is a must for growing up. And then he says this, a part of us hates limits. We won't accept them. This is part of the reason why grieving loss biblically is such an indispensable part of spiritual maturity. It humbles us like little else. I want to say a bold claim here. I believe that this issue is one of the primary lies pervading the world today, and one of, if not the primary reason that we lack contentment in our lives. Let's take a look at just one area of life to see it play out. As many of us in this room, we love to work hard. You know, we grew up and the Bible says to work hard, to work as we're honoring to God. But some of us love to love our work so deeply. And here's just a couple statistics on work. Americans work on average 137 more hours per year than Japanese workers, 260 more hours per year than British workers, and 499 more hours per year than French workers. In the midst of that work, from the American Institute of Stress, they say that 83% of workers face workplace stress. Stress causes 1 million workers to miss work every single day, and stress is causing 120,000 deaths and $191 billion in healthcare costs annually. Work is an amazing thing. It's something that's established by God. You and I should be working hard, and for some of us, you need to work a little harder than you're working now, but for many of us, work has been a place that we refuse to look at our limits. And so for some of us, we have worked and worked and worked and worked, and work has become an idol in our lives. And as much as you've sought to break that limit, you are not content as well because you see the destruction in your life. So many of us face discontent in our jobs, in our marriages, in our families, in our possessions, in our friendships, and many other areas of life. And the primary reason is that we hate limits. And when we refuse to embrace our limits, we end up missing out on contentment in any part of our life. When you and I refuse to embrace our limits, we end up missing out on contentment in any part of our life. The main illustration I thought of when I was thinking about this week was a baby gate that we used for our kids, for Judah, our oldest, and for Josiah, our youngest. And if you have little kids or if you have little grandkids, you probably know about these, the way our house is situated. There's certain times, our little guy right now is about 1.5 years, and man, if we just let him go, within like 5 or 10 minutes, the whole house just blew up, And it is great and it's fun, but there's certain times that we have to focus on something else for a minute. And if we don't put him in here, he's going to fall down the stairs, or we found toys in the trash can. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that can happen. And so occasionally when we need to, when the kids were growing up, we'd put them in here. And we have all kinds of fun toys in here. We got a football. He loves the book Corduroy, so, he's reading books and all this kind of stuff. And usually he enjoys it in here. But occasionally we'll set him in there and he's just not having it. And maybe you've seen this with your kids or grandkids, and he's just at the side of it. He's just shaking the gate like, let me out. I want out of here. I can't take this. I know, it's so sad, but it's for his good, right? It's for his good. And it reminded me, there he is. Yeah, it reminded me that he's trying to escape at that point. That's not good. It reminded me that sometimes this is how we deal with our limits in our lives. And so when we're confronted with the limit in life, I think there's 3 ways that we generally respond, and it's 3 ways that he or both of our sons have responded while they're in their little play area. One is that they're a victim. It's not fair. It's not fair that you've put me in here. I want complete reign of the whole house. I want to go anywhere I want to go, and I want to do anything I want to do. Again, like I said, sometimes our kids, they would shake the end of it, let me out, I don't want to be in here. And this is how we are. We say it's not fair that I don't have access to everything. It's not fair that I had the upbringing I did. It's not fair that I don't have more money or opportunity. It's not fair that I haven't found a spouse yet. It's not fair that I have a hard time learning compared to other people. It's not fair that my loved one died. Basically, the fact that I've been having a limit that's been placed in my life shows me that God's not being fair to me. The second way we respond is by being a rebel. I refuse to accept it. I refuse to accept it. Thankfully, our boys, as much as that picture showed that Josiah was trying to get out there, thankfully our boys never figured out how to get out of here. But my little niece, Zoe, when she was 2 years old, my sister woke up at 1 a.m. hearing something downstairs. And she was 2. Not only did she break out of her bed and break out of her room, but she was starting to go out the front door at 2 years old. And so obviously at that point they had to do something, right? So they started to kind of lock her in different places and trying to make sure she was safe at night, because they couldn't watch her all the time. So when she was sleeping and they were sleeping, she started to find little like hairpins and things around her room, and she would start to pick the lock to get out of her room at 3. I love her. I love her to death. She's 5 now, and even now at 5, they are just at a loss. They have no way to figure out how to contain this girl because she just refuses to accept the fact that there's any kind of limits in her life. Maybe you've seen videos from the internet about escapee kids that break out of their crib and do things. Basically, kids refuse to accept those limits, and for many times this looks exactly like us because when they break out of those limits, it's dangerous for them. And it looks like us when we rebel against the limits in our lives. When we refuse to accept limits on our time and we schedule ourselves into oblivion. When we refuse to accept limits on our physical bodies and we constantly do things in our life that we know over the long run are going to destroy our bodies, but we do it anyways. When we refuse to accept limits on our opportunities, we say yes to everything and thereby, doing a million things poorly and nothing well. When we refuse to accept limits on our status of who we are as people, and this is really popular in the world today. When you look at issues like feminism and masculinity or gender issues or socioeconomic and political issues or other things, there's often legitimate questions being raised in those conversations. But the thing that breaks my heart is that very few times in those conversations does the attention go to God and what God has to say about them. And more often than not, it's a refusal to accept any kind of limits in somebody's life. Janelle can tell you how many times I see the news or movies or TV shows and I get so frustrated because there's an agenda that's pushing something to say that, this tribal group, this certain group of people, they're just saying that I want everything. And unless somebody gives me everything, I won't be happy. But if every single part of us and every single way that we thought of ourselves was pushed to a complete extreme, nobody would love each other and there would be no functioning society because each one of us has limits in our lives. Often we rebel against those limits because we hate them so much. If we're not going to be a victim, we're not going to rebel, then the best we can do is to be a sleeper. To say that the best I can do is to avoid the reality of my limits. One day at least I came into the room when Josiah was in his play area, and there he was almost asleep in the middle of the blanket in his play area. For some of us, I think when we don't want to be a victim, we're not a rebel, we just say, you know what, I'm just going to numb the pain. Like, I don't know what else to do. And so we scroll Instagram or we scroll Facebook and we look at all these other people that we think are having better lives than us while we numb ourselves to those things. We get into drugs and alcohol or something else that would put us in a place where we can just numb the pain. We look to pleasure. We're unhappy with the limits in our relationships and the people around us. And so we seek out pleasure in unhealthy ways. When we don't like limits but we don't know what to do, we often just numb the pain that we feel. And Peter Scazzaro says there's no greater disaster in the spiritual life than to be immersed in unreality. In fact, the true spiritual life is not an escape from reality, but an absolute commitment to it. You see, when we try to break out of these limits, we're trying to go to a place that's not true. What is really true in our lives is that every one of us has limits. Every one of us is within our spiritual play yard that we've been there and there's been limits put in our lives. If we're unwilling to accept it, then we're basically plotting something out in our brain that's not really true. So often we become a victim, a rebel, or a sleeper because we don't like these limits. But here's the strange thing. You see, Josiah in his play yard, two things that are important. We did not put him into the play yard to torture him. We did it for his good. We're not putting him in there for 16 hours a day, We put him in there for very short periods of time when there would be a lot of chance that he would be out of there hurting himself in some way. We put him in there because we love him. And the second thing is that if he or another child would stop spending all their time trying to get out and trying to not accept the limits, he'd be able to turn around and look within there and see all the amazing toys he has to play with. See, so often we are fighting against the constraints and the limits in our life, and we're missing out on what's right in front of us. Like a child, limits are often for our good. A child without limits is dangerous. A teenager without limits is reckless. An adult without limits is overwhelmed and aimless. We talked about those statistics about stress and work as one example. But also, without limits, nothing would be of value in our lives. If you didn't have limits in your life, nothing would be of value. Imagine if there was no limit to your time, to your energy, to your money, to your relationships. Would any of it have value? I was reading an article recently that Jeff Bezos, who I believe, he's the owner of Amazon and Blue Origins and a couple of things, but I think he's the wealthiest person in the world right now. And he recently bought the most expensive house in Beverly Hills. So a really expensive place, and he bought the most expensive house that he could possibly buy. And it was less than 1% of his net worth. Less than 1% of his net worth. The most expensive house that he could buy in Beverly Hills. Now, do you think that he, although he may enjoy that house, do you think he values that house as much as the young couple that can barely scrap together enough to buy a house and start to fix it up over time? Probably not, because for him it's one of 10 or 15 houses most likely. And for him it's just 1% of his total income, his total net worth, and this couple has invested all their lives and energy into it. I also saw this demonstration that if you made $100,000 equal a grain of rice, that having $1 billion would be like 10,000 grains of rice. And again, it reminded me this idea that if we're not limited, one grain of rice, there's something of value. You can see that you better take care of that grain of rice. When you have 10,000 of them, you lose a couple of them, a couple 100,000, and you're like, oh, did those go somewhere? Like, I'm not even realizing that it's there. So many times we can't be content and enjoy what we have when we're constantly fighting or ignoring these limits. And it's true even of grief. I asked Peggy Farrington, who leads our Grief Share program, what's the biggest frustration or question that people bring to Grief Share? And she said that most of the time the question or the answer is that I just wish I had more time with my loved one. I just wish I had more time. And I totally understand that. But I wonder if there would ever be enough time. Would there ever be enough time in our minds? And I wonder how many of us in our grief, if we stop spending all of our energy trying to break free from the constraint of having lost a loved one, that we'd be able to take a step back within that limit and to recognize the value of the times we did have with that person. And to also recognize the value of the relationships we have around us more dearly, because you and I are both going to die. All of us will die at some point. The question is, how are we going to deal with those limits when they come into our lives? Grief is such a heart-wrenching journey, but how are we going to deal with it? That's the question we want to look at in Matthew 26, verse 36. We're going to start there. And we're going to look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He had taken his disciples and they had had the Last Supper together. He knows that Judas is going to betray him to the authorities. He knows that the cross and his death lay before him. And he's confronted with the overwhelming loss and limit in his life, of his friends, his family, and everything. He's being sent to die on the cross for your sins and for mine. And he sees that in front of him. And I felt like in this time in the Garden of Gethsemane, it's a perfect place for us to see how he responds to having a limit placed on him. Now, before we get into that, you might say, well, he's God, so it's not that big of a deal to him. Like, he's got more resources and energy to be able to put into this. I'm just a measly human. Like, how could he be an example to me? But I just want to remind us of Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. It says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. He was fully God, but he was also fully man, meaning that he felt what you and I felt. He walked in the shoes that you and I walked through. So when we have conversations and issues like this, that he actually knows about this journey more than we ever could, because not only has he created us and he knows us from the inside out, but he's actually walked it himself personally. So let's see how he dealt with the pain that was before him. Matthew 26, 36. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." And when he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." A couple things that we learn about limits through the example of Jesus. The first one is this, that he embraced the reality of his limits. He embraced the reality of his limits. He is faced with these big questions in front of him. He takes his disciples in that moment to a place that they knew of, had been many times before, an olive garden. It was most likely not that kind of olive garden, but a garden that had olive trees in it, and possibly a cave that was in that area. And he had some of them sit in the garden, and then he took 3 of his disciples with him. And it says this, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." When Jesus is confronted with loss and limits, he does not run from it. He embraces the reality of it. I think some of us have a hard time embracing the loss and limits in our lives, not because we don't want to embrace it, but because either intentionally or unintentionally we were taught it was wrong to grieve. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in counseling sessions and people have told me that in their families growing up, in their friend group growing up, it was common practice for things like this to be said. "Stop being sad about that. It will make other people sad." What? You're not thankful for all the other stuff you have in your life? Stop being sad. You can't have those feelings because what will other people think of us? We just have to move on and be strong. Christians don't give in to those type of negative emotions and many other things. And yes, we can't be completely controlled by our emotions, but when appropriate in this situation, Jesus didn't run from the reality of a situation. He embraced it and he grieved it. The words in verse 38 here about being sorrowful to the point of death are so deep in the original language. He didn't try to convince himself of the good side and the upside. He didn't hide from it. He felt the grief. And just a reminder, this is our God that we're talking about. There's something powerful in the picture that our God, who needs nothing, chooses to invite 3 of his friends along with him to grieve. As one commentary said, that the Son of God wants the moral support of 3 fishermen shows something amazing about the incarnation and our God. And it's so important. Some of us have been hiding or running from our loss and limits for far too long, and it's affected everything in our lives. For whatever reason, instead of embracing the reality of something in our lives, however small, we're living in a twisted state of reality, unable to break free from the actual limit in our life, but unable to accept the reality of the limits within those things as well. Maybe you're someone who has had physical limitations come into your life. Maybe it's an illness or old age or injury, and you focused all your attention on trying to fix it without really taking the time to realize and grieve the limits that are in your life now. Maybe a relationship has changed in your life. Maybe it's a mom whose kids are grown up now or leaving the house, or a friendship that went away, or family member strife, and you've never taken time to embrace that limit and truly grieve it. Maybe you've pushed your limits physically and time-wise with work and other things, and you want to change, but you don't know how. It would start with embracing the reality that you can't do everything. Maybe you had a dream in your life and it's never going to be realized, but you refuse to embrace that reality and truly grieve the loss of that dream. Maybe you've lost a loved one and you feel like C.S. Lewis did in a book called A Grief Observed. He said, "And grief still feels like fear, perhaps more strictly like suspense or like waiting, just hanging about waiting for something to happen. It gives life a permanently provisional feeling. It doesn't seem worth starting anything. I can't settle down. I yawn. I fidget. I smoke too much. Up till this, I always had too little time. And now there's nothing but time, almost pure time, empty successiveness." Grief is something that feels so overwhelming. There's nothing but time now, and I just sit in that grief. Sometimes you feel as if you embrace the reality of that grief, you will lose something of the person or the relationships that you've lost. So you just sit in limbo. All I know is that Jesus gives us the perfect example that you and I, if we're going to embrace the reality and the gift of our limits, we have to be willing to grieve, truly, truly grieve the fact that there's a limit in our life now. Second, he embraced questions within his limits. Again, Jesus is the example of how to embrace our limits, and he doesn't shy away from questions or walk away. So many times you and I, when we're embraced with those limits, we just refuse to live inside of them, and we just walk away from God. We say, God, you're not fair. God, I refuse to accept this limit. How could you bring this into my life? And we just walk away from our relationship with God. And instead, Jesus runs to him with his questions. In verse 39, he says, my Father. He knows that this God the Father, is there for him and loves him and protects him. He knows that he can come to him with these questions. And he says, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me. Basically, God, is there any wiggle room to this limit? Is there any chance that this could change at all? And then after that, he says, but yet not as I will, but as you will. He says, but I trust you. Hey, I just want to bring this question to you. Can you change this limit in my life? Maybe it is worth praying and bringing questions to God about your physical limits or your time limits or your work limits or the many things in your life. You can ask him any question you'd like. God is not afraid of our questions as long as we're willing to listen to his answer and receive the limits that he deems appropriate. The Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, he had a limit that was brought into his life. He called it the thorn in the flesh, and many people think that it was an issue with his eyesight. And so he says in 2 Corinthians 12 that he pleaded 3 times with God. God, would you take away this limit? I can't see as well. Would you take away this limit so that I can serve you more? And 3 times he asked him. And then in 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10, it said, but he said to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So Jesus does respond. He asks a question and he responds, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And so Paul says this, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. And that is why for Christ's sake that I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So he asked God the question. He pleaded with God. He urgently went to God, and God responded at this time with a no, but he also said, no, but I will provide for you. Don't worry. There's going to be fun within this. There's going to be a situation within this. I'm going to use this opportunity. And so Paul responds and he says, okay, I asked the question, and so I'm going to respond and live within that limit, because when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And God used it so his ministry continued on. God is not afraid of our questions, but we have to be willing to listen to his answer. And Tyndale commentary says this, the only issue that matters is what are the limits of the will of God. Jesus' prayer is an exploration of these limits, but never an attempt to break outside of them. It's okay to sit in here in our limits and to explore the difference. You know, imagine, have you ever seen those movies or TV shows where babies can talk? And it'd be funny if Josiah was in here and he's like, Father, why have you put me in the play yard, you know? And I'd be like, well, son, here's what's going on. And he said, okay, Father, I understand now. And he goes to play with his toys. That's not going to happen. But often we feel like Josiah because we can't communicate exactly what we're trying to communicate, but God knows our hearts. Come to him with any questions you want, but make sure it's done within the limits that he gives us physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, and financially. And sometimes our God is a God of miracles. Sometimes he will break down that limit. Sometimes he'll allow us to physically or mentally or financially break through that and see amazing blessing. But sometimes that's not going to happen. And sometimes we are going to have a limit. And so that goes to the third thing that Jesus does. He embraced obedience through his limits. He embraced obedience through his limits. He had said earlier in verse 38 or 39, he said, if it is possible, God, may this cup be taken from me. If it's possible. Basically, is there a question? If it's possible, please take this limit away. And now it changes in the second and third time he prays. In verse 42, it says, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. I noticed that this week, and I thought that was interesting. He went from, God, is this possible? Asking a question, and then he realizes, okay, if that's not going to happen, if it's not possible that this will change, then your will be done. That's more committing himself to the obedience of walking through, understanding that his Father will take care of him, whatever path may lie in front of him. You see, loss and limits are painful, but one of the things that I'm reminded of through them is the powerful knowledge that I am a child of God. If I'm in a crowd of children, which ones do you think I will be concerned about explaining and talking to them about their limits? Which ones will I be most concerned about walking with them through the difficulties they might have? I might like all the other kids in the room, but I'm going to focus on my two sons because I love them and because they're my sons. And think about our lives. When we walk through those limits, sometimes God will not take that limit out of your life. It's just going to happen. And every single one of us in this room has some sort of limit physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. There's something in your life that has happened to you or that will happen to you that will create a limit in your life that you can't go beyond. And if we walk with God realizing that that limit's not going to change, but we embrace obedience in the midst of it, God can do amazing things and we will experience the love of God in a brand new way. Some of us are not content in our lives. We come to church, we do all kinds of things. We try to pray, we try to read our Bible, but you do not feel content in your heart. You wonder why it is that you feel like you're doing all the right things, and yet there's still an emptiness that you walk around with. Still a part of you that just doesn't sense the fullness that you're supposed to have. And I would tell you today, again, that bold claim, I believe that this is one of the primary reasons. But we haven't realized that we are not God and that there are limits in our life, that you and I have limits in our life that put us in a place that remind us that we are weak, that remind us that we're human. And we have fought so hard against them to be a victim, to be a rebel, to sleep on those things. And if we would just embrace the fact that you and I are not God and we can't do everything, then maybe you would find contentment, like Josiah in the playpen, turning around, realizing that there's so much fun within those limits. We'd realize the value of what God has given us and what we can walk with him about. I found, and I want to close with this, I found a powerful scripture in Hebrews chapter 5 this week. It says this: during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Did you hear that? Look at Jesus. He was the one that with fervent cries and tears, yes, grieve. You're in the midst of a limit right now. You're feeling the pain of being in that limit. Yes, cry out to God the Father, just like Jesus did with fervent tears and fervent cries to the one who can save him from death. But in that moment, he couldn't be taken away, and praise God that he wasn't taken away from dying on the cross, because you and I would have no hope in our lives if not for that. If not for the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, you and I would have no hope. But in the midst of that journey, it says this: son though he was a son of God, and yet he learned obedience from what he suffered. There's some times in our lives that we are going to have to embrace the gift of the limit. We're going to have to understand that whether it's a loss or a limiting factor in our life, that if we stop trying constantly to fix it and change it and do whatever, and we just embrace God in the midst of it, that he will teach us and help us to learn obedience in the midst of the suffering. It can be a difficult thing. I wanted to have Peggy Farrington, who has worked on our staff for a long, long time, does such amazing stuff around here, but also helps to lead our Grief Share ministry. She's just going to come up and share a little bit of her testimony, the testimony she often shares in Grief Share about her own grief journey. So Peggy, do you want to share a little bit about what started your whole grief journey and what it looked like in the process?
Yeah. In July of 1997, my mom suddenly passed away, and I found myself bitter, angry. I stopped attending our church. It happened to be 3 months before my wedding when she died, and I was the victim. And Bob and I got married, and then I found myself planning weekly, daily pity parties for myself. And it just was a yucky, ugly time in our life. Bob came home from work one day, and he said to me, this is about 3 years after we were married, he said, "We're going to church. We haven't been to church since your mom died. We're going to church." And my response was, I looked at him, I said, "You have a good time with that." And he said, "No, we're going to church." So we came to Eastern Hills. They had just opened this new sanctuary, and that's where I reintroduced myself to Jesus. We got involved here with Bible studies, and I found that the more the more time I spent with God, the more time he was healing my heart. And as I grew closer to God, my grief was going away. I got involved with Grief Share, attended the class, and as much as I miss my mom, my heart is so healed from losing her that my relationship with Jesus never would have been what it is today had I not walked this journey.
As you, as you share that story in Grief Share, as you watch people walk through this journey, what are some of the places in this journey that people get stuck the most, do you feel?
I think a lot of times we blame God. He did this to us. We play the victim. And as you said before in your sermon, when we are weak, he is so strong. And he's with us this entire journey. He never left my side.
Yeah. I know we're finishing up a Grief Share class now, but one will be back in the fall, right?
September 14th,
Okay.
we start 7 o'clock on Mondays over in the meeting place.
And then you'll be out in the atrium somewhere if
Absolutely.
people want to talk? Yeah, and we always have resources for somebody that's walking through that grief journey.
It's a great program if you've never been through it.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy. Appreciate
Thanks.
it.
So as you leave today, walk just knowing that he is so good. And everything that he's teaching you through is just making you better and transforming you into the person that he has created you to be. And guys, have a great week. Enjoy the sun today. Be blessed.